All right, everybody. Thanks so much for being here. We'll get started here. For anyone who's new here, my name is Robert Driver. I'm a postdoc at Duke University, and I want to welcome you here to the AOS Student Research Grant Seminar Series. Um, each year, as you might already know, the AOS offers funding to students and early career researchers with the AOS Student Research Grant. And the AOS Student Research Grant Seminar Series celebrates that challenging and innovative work of the AOS Student Research Grant recipients by sharing that work to all of you. So each week we showcase the research or research plans of a 2024, 2023, or 2022 AOS Student Research Grant winner in the seminar style format like we are here today. And we have one seminar each week for 15 weeks. We're in week 6 right now, so approaching the middle. And I want to thank everyone for being here and to thank the AOS Student Affairs Committee, Chris Ann Handel and Ramona Fletcher for support and input, and thank Annie, our speaker today. So before we turn our attention to Annie's research, I want to mention if you have any questions, there will be a Q&A at the end of the talk, and you can participate by raising your hand, and I will unmute you if I see your hand raised if you would like to speak your question, or by typing in the chat box or also in the Q&A box. So one of those three ways I will monitor all of them. And I'd like to remind everyone that this is an AOS sponsored event, and that all participants are required to follow the AOS virtual meeting event code of professional conduct. And I will post a link to that in the chat. I'll also post a link to a post-seminar evaluation form where you can provide feedback to help us improve the seminar series, and a contact email for the AOS Student Affairs Committee. And please also be aware that we're recording this talk. Okay, so for today, Dr. Annie Madsen is currently an NSF postdoctoral fellow in biology at the University of California, San Diego. And Annie's academic career began with a bachelor's degree in biological sciences from University of Nebraska-Lincoln. And as an undergraduate, Annie researched weather effects on the detection of canid species at camera traps and going back. And her research from these projects is published in Journal of Wildlife Management and Wildlife Society Bulletin. And following her undergraduate degree, Annie stayed on at University of Nebraska-Lincoln, now working in the lab of Dr. Dai Shizuka, studying how social structure interacts with weather and demography in golden-crowned sparrows, which we'll hear about today. And Annie's PhD research was published in Proceedings of National Academy of Sciences and Behavioral Ecology, and was also, I believe this is correct, was also featured in Dai Shizuka's plenary talk at the 2024 AOS meeting last year. So I just wanted to check on that, mention that. Following her PhD, Annie was awarded the NSF Postdoctoral Research Fellowship in Biology, working with Dr. Sherman Da Silva on social networks in Asian elephants. I believe that's correct too. And her work with Dr. Da Silva is published in Scientific Reports and Philosophical Transactions B. And in addition to the AOS Student Research Grant, Annie has also won the American Society of Naturalists Student Research Award. And with that, I will turn it over to Annie for her talk entitled Causes and Consequences of Social Structure in Golden-crowned Sparrows.
Great. Thank you so much for that introduction, Robert. I'm really glad to be here to talk to you guys today about my dissertation research. And of course, I was supported by this AOS Student Research Grant. I wouldn't have been able to finish my dissertation without it. So I'm very thankful for that. And I'm very grateful to be able to talk to you all about that work today. So, if I can advance my slides, there we go. All right, so I'll be talking a lot about social networks today. So I'm going to start out with a quick preview of what those are. So social networks are the summary of interactions between individuals and groups in a population. And in a network, these circles or nodes represent individuals, and then the lines between them, or edges, represent the presence and the strength of a relationship. So the social structure, or the type, quality, and pattern of relationships, corresponds to where those edges are. And then for social organization, we're going to be looking at the characteristics of these nodes and then how they're grouped across different scales of organization. So for example, pairs, groups, and populations. And let's look at that a little bit more closely. So at these different scales, first, we have these individual interactions, which we can think of as at this kind of dyad level, so just between two pairs, or between one individual and all of their friends, which we generally call like an ego network. And the interactions at this scale build up to create these group and population structures, so social communities, and then all the way up to all of the connections across a population. And then in turn, this social structure at higher levels can drive individual behaviors. So individuals, again, influence how social groups form, how they interact across the population, and then the interactions have consequences for individuals and populations, such as disease spread, information spread, or what social position an animal can take. And networks can allow us to look at when changes are occurring and then identify the sources of those changes. And that's important because social relationships actually change quite a bit over time. So these networks are really a somewhat static view of relationships, but they're actually really dynamic, right? They change in response to a lot of different factors. And these different factors, I generally group into two different broad drivers, which either come from outside of the social system, I'll call exogenous, or internal to the system, which I'll call endogenous. And so exogenous are generally these things like resource distribution, seasonality, things that are not inherent to the individuals. And then endogenous is things like individual decisions, those social factors, and life history. And so using kind of this framework, I use this to investigate really broadly in my research what drives social structure and organization across scales, and then to determine what are the behavioral consequences of social structure for individuals. And again, I'm doing that with these endogenous and exogenous factors. So an exogenous one will be this space use, where I'll be looking at social spatial fidelity. And then those endogenous factors will be demographic turnover, so who is in a network and how that changes, and then social information, how it's spread through a network. And as we said already, we did this work in golden-crowned sparrows. So this is a migratory bird species that lives in Western North America. They breed in Alaska and Canada, and they migrate south along the west coast of the US. So my collaborators and I have studied these sparrows at the University of California, Santa Cruz Arboretum, and they started this program a long time ago, much far before my time. It's been over a decade that they've been collecting data on these sparrows. And so in the winter, these sparrows have what we call high fission-fusion dynamics in these foraging flocks. So they come together for short periods of time, forage together, and then break apart on an individual level and join and leave different flocks. So that membership turns over really frequently. Golden-crowned sparrows are also a really great system for investigating the effects of demographic turnover in a population because they have these somewhat intermediate levels of turnover. So here on the left, you see the black points represent the proportion of birds that returned from the previous year. And then the red text above them represents the population size in the current year. And the dotted line is that average proportion of returning birds in each year. And you can see that's around 50%. Right, so we leverage these natural turnover events to see how birds change their relationships from a previous season. With regards to space use, we also know that they have really remarkable site fidelity to their winter site here. So even though they're migrating thousands of miles, they return every year within about an average of 27 meters. Okay, back to social networks. So as those social foraging flocks are moving across the arboretum, we record their membership in the flocks, and that's over the entire winter season. And then we build social networks from all of those interactions. So in this network, a node is an individual sparrow, and then an edge is that connection between them, which I calculate as this weighted association index. It's called the simple ratio index. And what this represents essentially is how likely are these two birds to be found in one of these foraging flocks together out of any time that they're seen in a foraging flock. We also know, because this population has been studied for many years, that the winter flocks are not kin groups. We also know that birds in the same winter social groups do not breed in the same areas. So the social connections we see here are really isolated to their winter site. And they don't protect territories here in the winter, but there can be some dominance contests over food. And overall, birds that are more familiar with each other can spend more time close together, they can feed more together, and they spend less time on vigilance behaviors. So these can be really beneficial flocks for them. Okay, so with all of that background, I'm going to be talking about those different endogenous, exogenous effects, and I'm going to do that at these different levels of organization. So I'll group these into, if you can see my mouse here, on the left, this will be pairwise or individual, and then community, and then the entire population. And so I'm going to start with at the individual or pairwise level, and I'm going to be talking about some both endogenous and exogenous factors. So looking first at how stable these dyadic connections or pairwise connections are for birds, and then looking at the consequences of losing flock mates. Okay, so recall that I use that simple ratio index as the edges in my network, which gives us the strengths of connections between birds. I use these Mantel tests to test the correlation between the edges in consecutive networks over 12 years. So the correlation between the first and second year, second and third year, et cetera, to see how stable those pairwise relationships are. And so here's the results of that test. On the y-axis is the Mantel R statistic, and on the x is the pair of years that's being compared. And this Mantel R ranges from -1, which is a strong negative correlation, to +1, which is a strong positive correlation. And so we see we have these significant positive correlations over the entire study period, although there is some fluctuation, right? But for the most part, we see that birds that return do keep their connections from the previous year. So since birds seem to prefer to maintain those relationships over time, what happens when they lose, oh, sorry, there's my result. So what happens when they lose social partners? So here's this exogenous effect driven by, or exogenous endogenous kind of interplay, where we know that social connections can be tightly linked to space use, and we know that these birds return with really high precision to their winter site. But I wanted to ask, how does losing flock mates affect that space use, affect that spatial fidelity? This also helps us to understand, are birds returning to the winter site because of their friends or because of the location? So remember again that birds flock with the same flock mates each year that we just established. Those social relationships appear to be fairly stable, and they're important, right? Since social and spatial processes can be really tightly linked, we're asking this question about this centroid shift, which I had showed you earlier, right? This is their measure of spatial fidelity between years. On this, sorry, excuse me, on this picture on the left, this is the study site that's overlaid with a grid cell. So that 27 meters is about 3 grid cells where they're moving between years on average. But I want to, again, see how losing flock mates affects this space use. So I looked at the relationship between that spatial fidelity, or centroid shift, and social fidelity, where I calculated a flock mate loss index as the proportion of top connections that a bird lost from the previous year, and that is due to the loss of a flock mate, so that flock mate is no longer in the population. And this index ranges from 0, which is no partners lost, to 1, which is all of them are lost. All right, so on this graph, the y-axis shows that change in space use with our centroid shift metric. The x-axis shows the loss of flock mates. And so we found here that birds who had lost more flock mates moved their space use more than birds that had lost fewer flock mates. So there is this great effect of losing social partners on their space use, where social fidelity affects their spatial fidelity. Furthermore, when birds return over multiple winters, we see that their space shifts actually significantly decrease. So they're returning with greater precision in each consecutive year. But that's kind of in opposition to this other effect of them moving more and more as their flock mates are leaving. So to look at this relationship with a little bit more detail, we separated the youngest and the oldest birds in the population into different models and asked if this relationship suddenly changes for older birds versus younger birds, since we see that older birds on average are shifting much less. So on the left are going to be birds that only returned for their second winter. This is the youngest birds in the population that could have possibly returned. And then on the right are birds that returned for 3 or more winters. And so we see that the significance of this relationship suddenly disappears for younger birds, no longer significant, even though they generally, I'm sorry, and then for older birds, these are guys on the right, even though they generally have smaller space shifts, they're actually even more strongly affected by losing their flock mates. And there's a lot more variation in general for these younger birds. So that as they're coming to their winter site, and yes, they return and they're becoming more and more precise to their space, their specific space use that they're migrating to. They have, excuse me. All right. So they have lots of variation, but they become more precise in their space use as they get older. And it seems like those relationships that they have are also becoming more important. So to sum up at this pairwise or individual level, the returning birds are keeping their old connections as long as those friends also return. And then when many of their close friends are not returning, the consequence is that individuals move or change their space use. For older birds, those consequences are even stronger. And the space use could come from this change in space use could also come from other social pressures, from other demographic processes. So for example, new migrants may shift the social networks as they integrate into the population. Older birds may build new relationships to recover from partner losses. So now I want to move on to the next level, which is the community level. And here I asked how the demographic composition of social communities influences social structure over time, where this is that endogenous change that's happening. So I want to look at social communities. Here is the first network of the study from 2009. And from looking at the entire network, you can see how connections among birds vary, right? So there are some that are really highly connected. There are some that are a little bit less connected. And there's kind of a separation in the network, right? So using this information, we can identify communities from the network structure. And I used this clustering algorithm that's called Louvain clustering. It adds individuals to groups iteratively until this modularity is maximized. So what that means is that there are more connections within a community than between two different communities by the time the clustering algorithm is finished. So here are these three communities in the first year that it identified. But next, I wanted to evaluate the long-term community structure and composition. So to do this, I used an additional algorithm, which is called MajorTrack. And what this does is detect communities over temporally consecutive networks, and then determines whether that community is the same based on whether it has the same majority of members between years. I'm going to be simplifying the network view for a moment so we can focus specifically on the long-term community dynamics. And we're going to do that using an alluvial plot. So the colors in this stack of rectangles corresponds to the color of communities in the network on the left here. So we use this view to understand the changes in community membership over time. So here is the second stack, which is the 2010 communities. And these gray bands represent stable individual members, while the colored bands represent individuals that changed communities. And that's going to be the same color as the source community where they originated. And so this is to help you visualize the changes, where gray means same, color means there was a change. So we're going to look at this now over the course of the entire data set. This is all the social communities for all years. So I'll give you just a second here to take that in. Okay, so again, we're seeing this somewhat relative stability where there's lots of thick gray bands throughout, but we do see that there are lots of changes happening as well. So knowing that there are these multi-year communities where there is quite a bit of stability, but there's also quite a bit of change. I asked how changing membership influenced the community structure over time. So returning to the network view for a moment, by definition, our clustering algorithm identifies that based on that clustering of connections. So most of the connections are going to occur within the communities. But then there are also some individuals that are highly connected across communities as well. So I wanted to know how demographic composition is affecting the community structure over time. And I did this by, for the community level, right, by calculating this metric that's called community cohesion. So I'll illustrate this with the red community here, where cohesion is the sum of edges, which are weighted by that SRI metric, within and between communities, divided by the total connections within and between communities, right? So all edges, where did my mouse go? All edges within A over all connections A plus B. Next, I quantified the demographic composition of communities by distinguishing between returning birds, which could either return to the same community or switch communities, and birds that are completely new to the population, so newly immigrated. And I asked how that composition influenced these structures. So to do this, I ran 3 separate models, and this is because the different measures of demographic composition are proportions, and they add up to 1, so they have to be separate. Each model here uses one of those demographic composition methods, and those are the proportion of same all the way on the left, switched in the middle, new on the right. So for the proportion of the same members, we found that there was no significant relationship between the structure and the same members. Although what we see here is that there is fairly high cohesion just overall, right? And remember that we do expect that some of this has to be driven by the same communities, excuse me, just purely because the community would not continue to exist without them, right? We define these long-term communities based on how many members are the same. But having more of the same members does not increase cohesion. So for the next metric here, for the proportion that was switched, there was a decrease in the cohesion when a community had more members than there were in a different community last year, right? But this relationship was most likely due to these outliers over here, and there's kind of a shifted distribution on the left. So initially, this was a significant relationship, but it doesn't really. We're not confident in that because of the distribution of the data. But bird switching communities, just to think about this a little bit more, the birds that are switching communities, they are building new connections with immigrating birds, right? And we know from the individual level that they're still keeping many of their friends from other communities. So it would make sense that they could be decreasing the boundaries between communities by just increasing connectivity. And then finally, for the newly immigrated individuals, we found that they actually significantly increase community cohesion. So this was quite surprising for us because it does turn out that these new birds are really a strong driver of community structure, keeping them more closed off from each other. Yeah, so again, we would maybe expect that those individuals that are returning again and again to the same community are kind of driving that structure, but we're actually seeing new individuals keep those communities more bounded. So, okay, so furthermore, if we're looking at the number of birds that return between years, so this is more across the entire population, but their effect on the communities, right? So the number of birds that are returning, that proportion on the x-axis, is actually decreasing the modularity in networks. So recall that the modularity metric is just that maximized how closed off are communities across the entire network versus that community level one. So we see that returning birds are actually increasing those connections across the population. And that's directly in opposition to the new birds creating local connections within communities. So there's this really interesting complex interplay between that demographic composition and the network structure, the community structure. So I want to come back to this plot. Notice for a moment this, oh, there we go, this orange community. right? So this begins in 2013, and it lasts actually 8 years. So I think I'd mentioned earlier, I'll say it again, the average lifespan of one of these golden-crowned sparrows is about 2.5 years. So an 8-year community does not have the same individuals in it by the end of the community's lifespan as it did in the beginning. So I also so this was really an interesting idea to us, was to see how could this be that a community is really persisting over that long. And to investigate that a little bit more, we looked at the membership dynamics for communities that are lasting for multiple years. So you might think of that as these bands between the communities that we're looking at. And so we did this by looking at two different metrics for these membership dynamics. On the left is the between year proportion of community members. So from 2009 to 2010, 10 to 11, et cetera, how many of those members are actually retained. And then on the right will be the proportion of the original members in the community from the first year. So 9 to 10, 9 to 11, et cetera. Ooh. Okay, well, I just wanted my animations to not work here. I'm so sorry. Um, you might want to see that result if you could give me just a moment. I'm just going to go ahead and do this. Apologies. There we go. Okay, so let's look at this all together. So from the first year, from these consecutive years on the left, we see that there is kind of fairly low membership retention overall, but this is mainly due to turnover. So this is including all of the individuals that are entering the population for the first time and that are leaving the population, right? So there is around 10% of the individuals that are kind of staying by the end of some of these oldest communities. But yeah, so anyway, this is again between years. So between years, they're maintaining somewhat this level of consistent membership, but over their lifespan, it actually still is decreasing. So perhaps some kind of social senescence that's happening at the level of the communities. But again, overall, they're able to maintain membership, but it's fairly low. And then if we're looking at the proportion of membership from the very first year that a community existed, it's decreasing much faster, right? Almost exponentially. And this is actually very consistent with what we know about their turnover rate, right? So they're losing about half of their members due to turnover each year. But even by their fourth or fifth year here, they've already lost all of their original members. But because they're able to do this, maintain this consistent membership between years, there is that stable rate of turnover and recruitment. And so that in itself is what's able to allow communities to persist longer than the lifespan of any single member. Now we can move on to these. Okay, so we do see there are a lot of profound effects of demographic processes across multiple levels of organization, but this, mostly at the community level here that we're talking about. But the turnover seems to support persistent social community structure by allowing lost members to be replaced consistently over time. All right, so we made it to the population level. All right, here I'll be talking about the structure of the population and how it influences the spread of social information throughout for individuals throughout the population. There we go. So to do this, I asked how sparrows responded to a novel resource. So I exposed them to a task and asked if it spread through the population by their networks. And I did this doing this puzzle feeder. Keep going. There we go. So on the right here, you see that there are two actions for this feeder. There's a red door on the left and a blue on the right. And we have two subpopulations on opposite sides of the study site that were seeded with opposite preferences. And the motivation behind this is that if social learning is occurring and is isolated among these subpopulations, It's evidence for cultural transmission of kind of a neutral preference. So again, at site 27, we taught the two birds to prefer this red door, and then at site 25, two to prefer the blue door, and then we deployed puzzle box feeders from January through March in 2021 and tracked their feeding with motion capture video cameras. And really quick, I'm going to show you the training procedure. So we train birds in aviaries for up to 96 hours. And we use this incremental training protocol to teach them to prefer one of the actions. So we started with it completely wedged open. Once birds found the food and fed from the hole, we started incrementally closing it until it was closed completely and they were able to still complete the task. So we had 47 birds that learned the task out of 96 that visited. But so first I wanted to evaluate the preferences of birds that learned at different sites over the entire experiment, just to evaluate this evidence for those cultural variants, right? So on the y-axis here, this is the proportion of blue solves. On the x is each individual ID. And in this plot, the shape is going to represent which box they visited. So triangle for 25, square for 27. If they visited both sites and solved at both sites, it's a circle. There's also going to be different size of these points, which represents the number of solves. Oops, so lots here. So you can see over at the dotted line here, if you check this out, the more that birds are solving, so that have lots of these really large circles, it seems like the more they are approaching this 50% line, which means that they're closer to an even split between colors rather than a clear preference for one or the other. And so we really didn't have strong evidence here for establishing those subcultures. So from here on, what I did was evaluate the spread of the behavior through the population by pooling these red and blue solves because we didn't see these preferences that were very strongly and significantly remaining within the subpopulations. Sorry, I didn't specifically mention this, but you'll notice that most of the shapes here are circles, which means that actually most of the birds that solved visited both of the sites. So again, there was lots of exposure to both of the tasks. Okay, so here again, pooling all of these solved together. This graph shows how the behavior increased over time. The y-axis is that cumulative number of birds who learned at each time step, and then over experimental day. So on the left here, this is from Friends and None. This is the theoretical expectations for social versus asocial learning, where a social learning curve is more of this S sigmoidal curve, and asocial learning is more of a saturating curve, just straight exponential. And so what we see in our population is that the behavior spread was consistent with the sigmoidal curve with those social learning predictions, where it's an accelerating curve. And so this is some preliminary evidence for social learning, but there are other processes that can sometimes show similar patterns. So I used an additional analysis to build evidence for social learning in this population. Yeah. And this model is called a network-based diffusion analysis. So this uses the structure of the network to ask if the pattern of spread is consistent with social learning. The animation on the right here is showing the order of the birds learning with the color that they first learned. Just for illustration purposes, again, here we pooled all of the colors as the same behavior. And using this network-based diffusion model, we found that we did have very strong evidence for social learning, where there was a conservative estimate of about 77% of birds that were most likely to have learned by social learning. And the strength of connections in the network made it so that birds were 30 times more likely to have achieved the learning through social connections versus asocially, so through innovation. And yes, so we do have this pretty strong evidence that the birds were learning through the connections in their network. And so this is really important because we talked about the consequences of social structure at the very beginning, right? And so social interactions between individuals lead to this different structuring of relationships across a population. And then this structure has feedback that impacts individuals. So in this case, determining who is able to gain access to social information and who is able to learn a novel foraging task. Social foraging information in general could then strengthen relationships between individuals that can gain reliable information from their flock mates. So I'd like to sum up really quick with all of the different things I talked about here today. So starting on the left for the pairwise and individual level, we do see in this population that pairs of birds have very stable relationships between years, as long as they're returning. And we see that social fidelity can strengthen site fidelity, or weaken it if their flock mates are lost over time. At the community level, we see that there are communities that are really remarkably resilient to the effects of demographic turnover. And in fact, that turnover and that social fidelity in combination are what are leading to that the long-term social communities. And particularly, that's the integration of new immigrants into the population, where they increase that local clustering and since they're integrating in gradually, are able to maintain the lifespan of that community over time. And then finally, across the entire population, the social network structure allowed social information to spread through the population, making these connections really quite beneficial to individuals who are able to have strong positions in the social network. Okay, so with that, I'd like to thank lots and lots of people. So first of all, everybody who has run the Golden-crowned Sparrow project over the years, especially my grad advisor, Dr. Daishizuka, and our collaborators, Dr. Bruce Lyon and Dr. Alexis Chain. And then, of course, all of the other people who helped to collect all this data over the years, the Arboretum staff, interns, volunteers, students, etc. And I especially want to thank Mary DeAquino and Angela Brierly, who were my field managers during the pandemic. So they helped me set up the entire social learning experiment, which I had to run from Nebraska while the birds were learning in California. So I could not have done that without them. Thank you so much to those two. And then, of course, the video crew who actually went through all of the videos to gather all this information. And I'm especially grateful to be able to thank these people at this seminar because it was my AOS student research grant that was able to support the salaries of these individuals to make sure that they were fairly compensated for this. Really, it's a lot of work to go through all of these videos. It's tedious, and I really, really appreciate all of their effort and, of course, the support from the American Ornithological Society. And with that, I would be happy to take questions.
All right, Annie, thank you so much for that detailed look at the golden ground sparrow on its wintering grounds there. Very interesting to think about. Um, does anyone have any questions? Let me just check here. So we'll start off. Uh, Tom Langen asks, Zonotrichia often form mixed species flocks. Were there other sparrow species in your flocks? And if so, did you look at mixed species social networks?
Oh, so this is such a great question because yes, there are other species that do flock with them, and in fact, there were fox sparrows that also solved the puzzle. But unfortunately, we don't have those individuals uniquely banded, so we have no way to know their individual identities. If I could go back, then yes, it would be great to look at the mixed species interactions. So anecdotally, there was another like alternate task that individuals used to solve the puzzle box. That was they grabbed the platform with their beaks and they shook it, and it made seed fall out. Sneaky guys. And that was first innovated by a fox sparrow, and then the golden-crowned sparrow started doing it after that. So potentially there is information transfer happening between species as well. And yeah, I really wish we were able to look at that with this experiment. But yeah, for future studies would be really cool to look at.
Okay, great. And Clark asks, hold on one second. Um, a question on the interpretation of young and new birds versus returning bird. Sorry, everyone. Returning bird effects on the social community. Would you think that there is an upper level of relationships a bird can develop and maintain? For young birds, they're making all new relations. For older birds, they're maintaining established ones, trying not to add many, and thus their individual relationships are increasing cross-community connection. This is reminiscent of primate group size ideas from Dunbar and others.
Right. Yeah, it's that like social complexity and social brain hypothesis, right? Yeah, I would expect there has to be some kind of upper limit as far as who they're actually familiar with. So we know that birds do have familiarity with each other from past work. So my collaborator Alexis had done an experiment looking at their crown plumage and had obfuscated their and manipulated their crown plumage between individuals that were familiar, who had been in a flock together, and birds that had never been seen in a flock together. And those familiar birds, like they still recognize each other when their plumage is manipulated, but then they're more dominant. They have more dominance interactions with the unfamiliar birds that were, manipulated to look like they're super dominant. So we know that there is familiarity there, but there has to be some upper limit, even if it's just purely like they don't have the time and the space to be able to interact with every other individual in the population. We don't know what that upper limit is necessarily. There is a lot of variation in the connections between individuals. So I don't have like the Dunbar's number, but yeah, we do expect there is some kind of upper limit.
Yeah, I wonder who the most the social butterfly of the sparrow population is, who
Right.
reaches that upper limit. Um, okay, yeah, Jessica Eberhard asks, or says, great talk. And in the linked stacked figure, I think that's the one across years, there seem to be occasional major shifts. For example, during the 2012 to 2014 interval, are those associated with exogenous or endogenous factors? And when you observe space shifts by younger and older birds, were the shifts associated with habitat quality? So I guess there's two questions there. If you want to, uh, if I need to repeat any, just let me know.
Yeah, I'm just going to
Mhm.
pull that figure up really quick. Here we go. And then, okay. Okay, so the first question was about like these big shifts, right? So 2012 to 2014. Yes. So in here, there was also a methodological kind of difference. So, but I can't remember if it was 2014 or 13, but right in this that transition period, there were new grad students moving in and starting new projects in the population. So we had a big jump in the number of individuals that were able to be banded. And so there likely is some confounding effect here just of more individuals being in the population or being identified in the population. But I think the population size did also just increase in that year. So over time, there is fluctuation in the population size. And this, so let's see. So I would call that more of an endogenous factor because of the changing population size, but then a researcher factor as far as like methodologically. And the next one was space shifts, right?
Uh,
There is not really a change in habitat quality between years. So this is an arboretum. It's really highly managed. So there's really not much change in habitat quality or food quality between years, except in 2018. There was a parking lot that was built on the study site, like right in the upper right corner. So there was a huge piece of their habitat that was removed. So there was actually a higher shift in their space use for that year. But whether it was added into the model or removed, it didn't make a difference. There was still a really strong effect of the social fidelity.
Gee, thanks. Yeah, new grad students would be exogenous, I would guess.
Yeah, I would think
Um,
so. But again, not changing their behavior necessarily, but
right,
yeah.
right, sure. Method, yeah. Uh, Yang Kang Chen asks, I think you addressed this a little bit in the background, but he says, thanks for the great talk. Do we know if these individuals are also migrating together and are using adjacent breeding grounds?
Right, yeah. So the one of the previous grad students who predated me, Theodora Block, had looked at this, and they GPS tagged some individuals and so tracked them from their wintering grounds to their breeding grounds. And individuals in the same social community go to completely different breeding areas. So there's no evidence that they migrate together or that they breed in the same areas. It seems like it really is just the wintering grounds that these relationships are happening, and this is where they're important.
Great. And Richard Stanley asks, I think it is okay. I think it is very interesting that these wintering social groups are completely distinct from the social composition on the breeding grounds, which is what you were just describing. Do we know anything about how these winter groups form? Do they meet up somehow during migration and then arrive at the field site together, or do the groups form independently when they get to your site?
So as they're migrating in, but not everybody gets there at the same time. Obviously, it's more of a trickle in. And when we're looking at their social relationships here, this is after everybody has kind of migrated already. So there might be the occasional individual that arrives late, but we kind of separate those effects of the initial formation and then when they break up to begin migration again in the spring, because they're different flock dynamics, and yeah, so it's a different type of formation in that sense. And again, we don't have evidence that they're migrating together.
All right, and so I was wondering, when a sparrow switches its community, uh, is there any significant, or is there any evidence that they have interacted with that community previously when they switch to it, or or when they switch, are they more likely there's no difference to switch to a community that they have not previously interacted with or have?
So when birds are switching between these communities, it's likely because they do already have some relationships, right? So if we look back at, let me see if I have this right up here. Yeah, so if you look back
Hmm.
at the networks and at the community structure, there are individuals that have lots of connections between communities. Like these two right here are like major bridges between the communities. So I haven't looked at this in detail, but it is possible that it's these types of individuals that are switching between communities, and potentially because they're already kind of in multiple communities. So we detect these communities from the network structure, but that doesn't mean that they're discrete communities for the sparrows either. At this level, like this is where the connections are being, they're being clustered together. So it's more of these individuals that are having social relationships with each other, that are hanging out together, but they still can't interact elsewhere. A future direction that I think I would be really interested to go in is to look at more overlapping community structure to see
Mm.
how many of these individuals are really part of like multiple social communities.
Yeah,
Did I answer the question?
I think so. I'm asking that definitely in particular, but and then also like for example, that green one that's all the way in the top left, if that switches, is it more? I think you answered the question, but is it more likely to move to the blue one because I think I can see that there's interactions and it's overlapping with the blue, or
Yes.
just as likely to move to the red one?
In this case, if this bird returns in the following year and switches communities, I would a priori predict that it would switch to this blue one. Right? I don't even think it has any connections with the red one, so that would be pretty highly unlikely.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. And then Elaine Road had her hand up earlier, right when I was speaking, but uh, I think it went down. So Chris Ann has posted the post-seminar evaluation form as well there, just as a reminder for everyone. And I guess I'll ask one last question. Um, but which one should I even ask? How about were there feeders on the property besides
So
your
in
experimental ones? Yeah. Mhm.
So there were feeding areas where they baited to band, but
Mhm.
the flock relationships that we look at in these networks are not at those feeding sites. So there is some like supplemental feeding here and there. It's mostly for banding the new birds.
Okay, but so there could be additional interactions there when they come together that aren't measured in the data.
There could be, although in these, so if we're taking the social learning experiment and those feeders as an example, when we
Mhm.
make networks from their feeding interactions at the puzzle box versus their flocking interactions elsewhere in on the site, they're really highly correlated. Like social learning still, there's
Gotcha.
still evidence for social learning in both of those networks if we build them there separately.
And actually, one more. I'm just curious. In the social learning, because you have red and blue as separate data points, I guess, or n of two. Did the red and blue spread in the same way at the same pace and both social? Were those measured independently?
So I had initially planned to look at the spread of them separately, but because they just immediately visited both sites and were exposed to both like very quickly, very right away, I had not looked at that. I more recently was looking at them as separate diffusions to see kind of how they did spread, whether they spread separately. I mean, there still is some evidence for social learning there, but it's much harder to get the models to converge. And yeah, I think that's maybe just a sampling issue as well. Not entirely sure, but yeah.
Got you. Well, thank you so much, Annie, for a great seminar, and thank you for the audience for your questions. Really appreciate that. And with just one last reminder about the evaluation form, and if ever anybody wants to have an emoji clap here or whatever they want to do for Annie for a great talk, and we will see you guys here next week. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much, Robert.
Bye, guys.